The Global Poverty Summit in its inaugural year here in South Africa. Some people would ask, how does this initiative differ from so many other programs dealing with poverty issues?
Okay, basically we've timed it so it's the week before Davos. Davos is the meeting when everybody gets together and talks about how to make wealth and share it out amongst those who've got the wealth. Usually at the end they talk a bit about poverty. We wanted a summit that talks about poverty because we live in an affluent world. There's enough resources, enough organisational capacity and technology to stop everybody from being poor, and so we wanted to focus on that.
So some of the resolutions that have come out of this initial summit?
The main areas have been about the Millennium Development Goals, which is this set of 8 goals about getting every child into primary education, reducing mortality for mothers and children, a set of goals like that. So we've had a set of resolutions about that, and we've also been looking at the Doha trade round, and we've got some recommendations about that.
Let's talk about the MDGs first off, because there's the deadline of 2014 when many countries need to have at least met some of their initial targets, and we know that many African countries signatories to the UN program, but many are not going to meet those targets by their own admission.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing we have to note is the MDGs were set at a global level, and this was to stretch everybody's performance. And actually, I'm not going to go into the techniques, but the way they were set actually disadvantaged Africa, because Africa needed to make faster progress because it was starting from a lower base. And so the main message that one has to get across is Africa is not doing as well as one would want, but there's been substantial progress in many countries. Children don't die at the rates they did, health services have improved, education is much more across the continent.
I think the big issue on the MDGs is what's needed for substantive action. We understand the 8 pillars that need to be priority areas. Governments incorporated them in their welfare strategies. They talk about it. The policy papers exist. We need the tangible gains and benefits on the ground.
Yeah, this is right, and then there's 2 dimensions to this. We've got the present MDGs, 2011 to 2015, and there's really got to be an acceleration, a push to achieve those. That's going to take a lot of pressure from civil society, from NGOs, but also from the business sector, because if you want good labour forces, if you want cohesive societies, if you want to get these crime rates down, then we've got to push forward in making society fairer, and that's by pushing for the MDGs. So we need to push for the MDGs to be met in each African nation, and we can get much closer. Longer term than what we're calling on now is for African governments, African businessmen, African NGOs and civil societies to start thinking about what we do after 2015. Because to get that right, we're going to have to do quite a bit of talking and thinking. And so we're suggesting that we need to engage now in setting up a set of global development goals for post-2015. And they need to be different from the MDGs, because the MDG sell-by date is running out.
Ulrich, Professor Hulme is talking about a need for greater collaboration between the state, civil society and business in tackling poverty. And this is often a conversation we have as partnerships on poverty. And the approach generally that business has is, if the market works well, we are able to create jobs. Jobs translate into poverty reduction. Doesn't seem to actually be the case when you look at the tangible results.
Yes, but I think what you've mentioned here is so important. You know, I always said that any economy operates within the framework of government policies. And the main aspects are monetary and fiscal policy, but also labour policies. And if we look at that, and of course, you know, if you create the environment, then you still need the educated people at different levels of education to go in and do the jobs. So I think that, yes, we, in many countries, I think in Africa, we still sit with that cooperation between all players isn't there. But I think that, as Professor Hulme said, you know, we must get together, because poverty reduction is so important for growth and for stability in our societies. So I think it's so important that we get together and that, yes, we all talk to one another so that we can get these programs running in an efficient way.
But I mean, just finally on this one, Ulrich, the unions have always argued, we've seen growth in South Africa consistently over the last 10 or so years, but it's jobless growth. As this economy grows, what we see are inequalities broadening. The rich get richer and the poor remain vulnerable.
Yes, that's true. But unfortunately, I think that the trade unions are talking their own interests, and that is for the people who have jobs. And there are so many people in South Africa who don't have jobs, and that applies also to Africa. So actually, if we look at the trade unions, they have to broaden their views. And how do we get a labour dispensation where we can really get also these unemployed people into the system?
Right.
And unfortunately, if we look at the situation in South Africa at the moment, strength of rand, cost of labour rising, I think that we're going into a year where we're going to have more capital intensive structures in the economy.
I mean, Professor Hulme, on this tack, this is the Global Poverty Summit. It's not just about Africa. Lessons we can learn maybe from other parts of the world where growth has supported poverty alleviation.
Yes, and I think it's going back to what you were just asking about then. You were saying about we need markets to work, but we need governments to work with markets, and we also need people to work hard. And if you look at the historical record and the record across the world, then no country has really managed to get sustained economic growth for years on end and poverty reduction without having a state which is doing its part in terms of regulating the market so it doesn't damage itself and excessively take risks, and also to underpin education, underpin health services, to ensure the contracts can be honoured. And so we need the market to work, but we've sometimes forgotten we need the state to work too, if the market's going to work.
Another issue to be discussed at the Global Poverty Summit is the question of how to reinvigorate momentum in the Doha round of free trade talks, the so-called development round, raising the profile of developing countries. What's the link that you see between poverty alleviation and improving trade networks?
I think there's two very important links. I mean, the first one is if we could get fairer trade rules and regulations around the world, then that would that would allow economic growth in developing countries, and it would allow poverty reduction. But the second broader one is that at the moment the rich world talking with the poorer world, agreed to make Doha a development round. This was to be a round that was to promote growth where growth had not occurred in recent decades, and to reduce poverty. And the rich world needs to honour that promise. It needs to take the leadership, which may mean things may hurt a little bit at home. Difficult decisions about European farming, about the subsidies that American farmers get, about Japanese farmers. But we need to take the lead if we believe that trade is important. And the last 20 years we've been telling Africa and Asia that they've got to get into trade. We can't keep blocking them.
Ulrich, your views on this one, because we know that most of Africa's people live and work in the agricultural sector. And so if we can't get a decision taken at the Doha round of trade talks around removing market distortions, tariffs into Europe and America, subsidies for French farmers and American farmers, if we can't deal with those kinds of things, then we can't have a fair chance for African farmers. If we don't have movement at Doha, what else can we do?
I suppose very little. But the problem is that, if we look at this environment, you must always keep in mind that, for the politician, self-interest. And therefore, the American politicians will look after their own farmers. The same applies to Japan, the same applies to Europe. And it's also a political situation. And therefore, if we look at this environment, then we say, yes, we need this change in attitude, actually. And therefore, that, can the world grow enough food? Yes, at the moment we say there is enough food, but the distortions are there. And unfortunately, if we look at this situation, I don't think it's going to be an easy solution to this. But at the same time, we must also look at the environment in Africa. And I can remember that last year we looked at a report from McKinsey's, which said that the big problem in Africa is that they have to farm on little farms smaller than 2 hectares. And can they really compete against the efficient farmers, big farmers, in some of these big countries?
But if I could just come in there, I think there are things that you can do at an African level, independent of this global level. At the moment, 40% of the international trade in Asia is between Asian countries. In Africa, it's only 9% of the international trade is between African countries. And if African countries decided amongst themselves to open up their borders, to remove the obstacles they've got, then there's quite a big step forward could be made in that. Not to let the international actors off the hook.
Finally, and very briefly, the role of multilateral bodies. Some would argue that for over 20 years there's been partnership of some degree between the World Bank, the IMF, African governments, NGOs, donors, all working in various levels to address the poverty dynamic in Africa. And if it hasn't dented poverty, then maybe it's time to review those relationships.
I mean, first, it has dented poverty, but it hasn't dented poverty at anything like the scale that we would like. But then, I mean, to agree with you, yeah, we need to revisit those relationships and look at them very closely. And I think the problem over the last 15 years, particularly in Africa, has been the focus in a way on global action and international aid. And what we are proposing, certainly in our global development goals, is the focus needs to be on inclusive national development. We need countries to be in the driving seat. They need to be thinking about national development. That means thinking about poverty reduction, but also about growth, also about economic stability, because you can't just think about poverty reduction, which has been a bit of the pretense of the last 15 years. So we need these inclusive national development strategies. The role of the international system and these, the World Bank, the IMF and the UN, is then to support governments, and particularly to support those governments who are really taking this seriously and moving forward.